Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am Ursula Tavender, the joint CEO and co-founder of Flexbo. I'm just going to give everyone 30 seconds to join us. We have got some participants joining us rapidly. I'm just going to give them a moment to come into the webinar, and then we'll get started. For those of you who've just joined us, we're just giving 30 seconds for more participants to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us. Just going to look at the numbers now. Great, I think we'll get started. Thank you everybody for being here with us this afternoon for this webinar about flexible working for parents, how to ensure everyone benefits. I'm Ursula Tavender, the joint CEO and co-founder of Flexbo. We organise events to connect people leaders with best practice and peer-to-peer learning opportunities so that they can create inclusive and flexible workplaces for everyone. And we're thrilled to be partnering for our event in February with Working Families and with Talking Talent. And I am delighted on a personal level to be invited to chair this conversation about my absolute all-time favourite subject with you all today. So thank you so much for having me. And to everyone watching, thank you for being here with us. The 2022 Working Families Index, which was produced by Working Families and Talking Talent, found that flexible working supports career progression for parents and carers in the UK. However, it also shows that inequalities still persist around those who see the true benefits of flexible working. We know that working part-time, which is a pattern overwhelmingly held by women, is still a huge and genuine barrier to career progression in the UK. An analysis from the Global Institute for Women's Leadership shows that men working flexibly are more likely to work overtime than women are, which is positively correlated with higher levels of career progression. So in this hour together, we're going to be exploring this very complex picture of flexible working and gender equity. So we'll be discussing how employers can promote family-friendly working practices to make sure that women and men have equal chances to advance in their careers and that they have sufficient time to engage in their precious family lives. If you've got any questions as we go through the webinar, pop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can once we've discussed the research findings with our wonderful panel, who I'm going to introduce to you now. I am so excited to be here today with Kudzia Batul, the Head of Equalities and Strategy at the TUC, Hee-Jung Chung, Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Kent, and the author of The Flexibility Paradox: Why Flexible Working Leads to Self-Exploitation. Simon Kelleher, the Head of Policy and Influencing at Working Families, is also joining us, as is Rebecca Hurston, Managing Director of Women's Leadership and Coaching Programmes at Talking Talent. And last but absolutely by no means not least, Caitlin Schmid, Research Fellow at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today to speak on our panel. The format for this hour, so first of all, Caitlin is going to take us through the research findings to begin. And then after that, we'll dive headfirst into a conversation to explore the findings with our incredible panel before we move on to questions from you in the audience. So, Caitlin, without further ado, I would love to hand over to you, if that's okay, to present the research findings for us.
Of course, I hope you can all hear me and see the slides. Yes? Well, welcome from our part as well. Thank you very much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be speaking to you today and presenting this analysis on gender differences in flexible working and career progression using the Working Family Index that, as Ursula mentioned, was collected by Working Families and Talking Talent. And as Ursula said, this data found that flexible working is widespread amongst the UK workforce, and that both women and men working flexibly tend to report higher levels of career progression, but also skill acquisition. And while this is great news, the data also showed a concerning trend in that women in part-time roles were less likely to feel that they had progressed than other flexible workers. So using this data, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership conducted additional analysis to better understand what might explain the observed gender difference in career progression amongst flexible workers. And the findings that I'm presenting to you now will be made available to you after this webinar. So the Working Families Index surveyed 2,806 UK-based parents and carers in late 2021. And when we speak of types of flexible working arrangements, we distinguish between three types: location flexibility, which includes hybrid working and working from home; schedule flexibility, which includes job share, turn time work, variable hours, and control over when the work is undertaken; and finally, reduced hours, which includes part-time and term time working. So we see in the graph that flexible working is widespread for both women and men. The most common type of flexible working is location flexibility, and we see that men are shown to have greater access to this, likely due to occupational segregation. So men in our sample are shown to be concentrated in professional service industries, where 83% work from home or with a hybrid arrangement. In contrast, women are overrepresented in sectors that make working from home difficult, such as healthcare, retail, and education. We know from previous research that lack of access to location or schedule flexibility can result in women reducing their working hours after childbirth. In our data, we found that women were more than 2.5 times more likely than men to work reduced hours, and that also young workers and single parents are overrepresented in the sample. So career progression measures the extent to which respondents perceive their careers to have advanced over the past 5 years. Parents with flexible working arrangements reported higher rates of career progression than those working non-flex. However, I must note that we cannot infer any causal relationship, as higher career progression for flexible workers will likely be, in part at least, explained by the fact that there's greater access to flexible working in high status and high paying occupations with steep wage trajectories. We find significant gender gaps in career progression scores, irrespective of whether they work flexibly or not. In both groups, men's reported median career progression scores are 1 point higher than women's. The type of flexible work men do seems to be irrelevant to their level of reported career progression. However, for women, this picture is more complicated. While progression scores are higher when women access location and schedule flexibility, women working part-time report the lowest level of career progression, as you can see. The ability to work additional hours is likely a factor affecting career progression. Indeed, in our data, we find a statistically significant positive association between working additional hours and career progression for both flexible and non-flexible workers. We find that working additional hours is widespread among all respondents and especially among men, and that this is higher for flexible workers. And this is a phenomenon known as the flexibility paradox that Hee-Jung Chung coined, or a term that she coined, and I'm delighted to have her here with us today. So she will be surely speaking more to you about this phenomenon. So when looking at different types of flexible working arrangements, we see that the proportion working additional hours rises for women and men with location and schedule flexibility. Yet we find that this increase in overtime does not apply to women working reduced hours. And this, of course, is a great cause for concern in light of the positive association with career progression. So this would suggest that women working part-time are falling behind in a culture that seems to expect and also reward regular overtime. So what other factors are holding women back? We find that 55% of parents cite access to flexibility as a reason for staying in their current role. And when we break this down for those on reduced hours, we find that this rises to 57%. The ability to balance childcare is a further critical factor influencing career decisions, especially for women. We corroborate findings from previous research showing that women are more likely than men to work flexibly to manage childcare. Moreover, we find that 7 in 10 parents would need to consider childcare options before going for a new job or promotion. and that this is particularly true for mothers on reduced hours. So these findings suggest that part-time workers, especially women, are having to trade career progression for flexibility to manage childcare responsibilities. Structural factors, such as the gender division of unpaid labor and deficits in care services, likely play a key role in explaining women's greater part-time engagement and also the lower career progressions we're seeing. We are currently witnessing a fragmentation of the labor force into different career tracks, where women with care responsibilities and no access to location or schedule flexibility are disadvantaged. Yet, career progression should also not depend on regular overtime, neither for women nor for men. To end the penalization of part-time workers, predominantly women, cultural and organizational change is needed to ensure that career progression ceases to be linked to excessively long working hours. Now here, I'd like to share with you a quote from a previous piece of research we conducted in partnership with Working Families and the University of East Anglia, and which was funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And I think this quote from the single mother nicely sums up the research findings. It would have been relevant to provide a richer intersectional analysis of gender differences in career progression and flexible working, looking at differences by factors such as family status, given that this is a single mother saying this, but also other factors such as income, ethnicity, industry, and region. Unfortunately, however, once the data was broken down into these three different types of flexible working arrangements, the sample sizes were too small to permit such a richer analysis. So based on these findings and drawing on previous research we conducted together with Working Families, we have put together a list of recommendations. And I couldn't fit all of these on this slide, but you will find the full list in the report that will be released after this webinar. And these recommendations mainly speak to organizational change, but as I mentioned, wider structural barriers need dismantling as well. And luckily, we have an excellent panel here with us today, and I'm excited to hear their thoughts on the wider changes that are needed to reduce inequalities and also, to make sure that flexible working benefits all parents in the UK and also workers in general. So on that note, I would like to hand back to you, Ursula, and please open what I'm sure will be a very stimulating discussion. And I want to thank you all for your attention.
Caitlin, thank you so much for taking us through that. It's utterly fascinating. And yeah, I'm absolutely really excited to get stuck into these questions. So thank you for that. Hee-Jung, I'd like to come to you first, if that's okay, to talk a little bit more about the term flexibility paradox that Caitlin mentioned that you've coined. Can you tell us more about the reasons behind this phenomenon and how it might affect women and men differently, please?
Yes, thanks. First of all, Caitlin, wonderful report and presentation. I think, yeah, we could talk for hours, but let's just get down into it. So flexibility paradox is this. In the current kind of discourse on most people's psyche, there's this idea that, oh, if you work flexibly, you're not really working hard, you're not really working, you're working from home type of a thing. But what we find is evidence, as Caitlin has very, well shown, is that people who have that flexibility, especially location and schedule flexibility, they end up working harder and longer. So they end up doing more overtime. There's a number of reasons behind this. One is about this very work-centric and also long hours work kind of focused work cultures where if you want to be seen professional or serious, motivated about your job, you have to work those long hours. Otherwise, you do lose your promotion chances. So rather than flexibility enabling people to better balance work-life balance, it also most enables workers to work all the time and everywhere, creating in a way a vicious cycle of hyper competition. Also, it isn't helped by the fact that there is still a lot of insecurity in the labor market. So you feel like if you don't look like and you aren't working all the time everywhere with that flexible and blurring of boundaries between work and private time, you end up looking like you are a slacker, essentially. The difference between men and women is that essentially, because men are the breadwinners and considered breadwinners in our society, men have the capacity to extend their working hours much more than women, whereas women, as Caitlin shown, end up having to work part-time but even those mothers who are working full-time don't have more time to give. So they don't have the capacity to increase working overtime hours as much as men. And this is why we see that difference in the career progression, where men can use that flexible working to actually enhance performance or adhere more to the ideal long hours culture and getting compensated as such, whereas women end up in many cases actually being penalized under the assumption that they won't be using that flexible working for performance enhancing purposes, but for childcare and other domestic purposes.
Like you say, we could talk for many hours about the good old gender stereotyping that's going on in workplaces, couldn't we? Thank you so much, Doug. That is absolutely fascinating. Just wanted to remind everyone in the audience, if you've got any questions at any point that pop into your minds, please pop them into the Q&A and we will get to them at the end of our conversation with our panel. So thank you very much for that. Anything, we have had a few questions submitted before the webinar, but if anything comes up, please just drop it into the Q&A. All right, next, I have a question for you, Kudzia, if that's all right. The analysis showed that flexible workers clearly report higher levels of career progression. But should we push for making flexible working the default? And how do we ensure that men and women benefit equally? I think it's well worth mentioning that there has been... Can you still hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we could hear you fine, Ursula.
You can?
Yeah, keep going. That's good.
Sorry, I've just lost you completely. I've lost my Zoom completely. Sorry.
We can still hear and see you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That threw me entirely. Zoom just completely disappeared and then reappeared. I have no idea what's going on. Sorry, everybody.
Working flexibly.
I'm here.
Ursula.
I'm here.
Working flexibly.
The perils. So this week there was an announcement by BEIS that the government intends to make flexible working the default from day one. And that will be a coming change. We don't know when that change will be happening at the moment, but as a result of a consultation that happened last year on making flexible working the default, that is the plan for that to happen. So Kudzia, over to you.
Thanks, Ursula. I'm hoping you can hear me okay now.
We can, thank you.
So really, I mean, it is great news and we welcome it that the government have taken seriously what needs to happen around flexible working. Not seriously enough, might I add. What have they done? They have, you can make 2 flexible working requests now. The employer has to show more transparency in their decision making, all of which is massively welcome, but falls really short of where we need it to be, which is we need a day one right of flexible working, and they call it that, everyone calls it that, but I always call it the day one right to be turned down. But we need jobs advertised flexibly at source as well. We need people to be able to go in to the decision making knowing what flexibility is offered so they can plan around it. But to answer your question specifically, should we make flexible working the default? And I love this question because for the life of me, I can't figure out why we would not make flexible working the default for all the jobs that we do. Because flexible working, by the way, doesn't just mean home working. There are all forms of flexibility. And if we can harness the talents of all of our workforce, surely that is for everybody's benefit. And I know we talk about this a lot, and the TUC, we are guilty of this loads. We talk about the benefits for women, the benefits for mothers, the benefit for parents, how it's better for dads. But the reality is that making jobs more flexible makes it better for everybody. It is better for disabled workers. It is better for people with caring responsibility. It is better for people that just want flexible jobs. And it means that we have got to have really efficient workplace policies that support good quality flexible jobs. And Hijab mentioned, and you mentioned, and Caitlin mentioned, we all talked about the part-time penalty, which is too often the lack of good flexible options has meant that people, particularly women, have taken part-time roles. And of course, part-time roles offer some flexibility, but they also come with a pay deficit. And that's a pay deficit that women can very rarely, if ever, equal out during the course of their careers. And then that, I am, cutting corners here, then we can talk about gender pay gap and pensions pay gap, things that always contributes to massive amounts of inequality between men and women. So yes, I think we should have flexibility, and I think it should be the default. And I think we've really got to rethink how we look at jobs. And I know that we as a movement, we as a trade union are trying really hard to sit down with employers and say, this is how flexibility has got to work. When I spoke to Caitlin, it feels like 100 years ago now, because it was right in the thick of the pandemic, during lockdown 1, 2, or 3, I can't quite remember. We talked about the experiences that people were having doing what I think the government thought was flexible working then, i.e. we were all sat at home, we couldn't do anything, and we had to teach our own children and fit our jobs in the time we had, and then fit everything else in as well. And, we went out to our members and we asked them, how are you? What is happening? And we were overwhelmingly told by thousands and tens of thousands, actually. We had about 40,000 responses over the course of a weekend of people coming back to us, women particularly, saying, I can't do my job in this space and then do everything else I have to do as well. This is not what flexibility is. And I think that's really important. We need to look at job design. We need to look at structure. But the start of it all is we need to give people the right to have their roles flexible, and employers have got to do what they have to do to meet business demands. Workers have got a right to live their lives as well, and we've got a role to match those two things up. And I think the flexible working bill is a really good start, but there is so much more that we need to do.
I could not agree with you more. And it's very interesting times, isn't it? Because I think that really scratches the surface of the progress that we need to make. And like you say, it's a massive step in the right direction, but it falls short of where we need to be. And where I believe it's possible for us to be, given the progress that's been made within so many organisations. And that's what drives us. So much of what you said, Kudia, spoke to me really, really on a personal level, because so much of what we try and do at Flexpo is dismantle that messaging that flexible working is just purely beneficial for parents. Clearly, they're one of the biggest employee groups that do benefit significantly from it. But like you say, people with disabilities, people who are neurodivergent, people who have mental health conditions, people who suffer from chronic illnesses, it's better for business. And that's the message here, isn't it? Is that what we're trying to do is make business better for the benefit of everybody and business. So really, thank you so much for sharing those experiences and insights with us.
It's also, I just want to say, it's also about now as well, isn't it? The fact that the pandemic has happened and that feels like, the ball is rolling down the hill. And we finally got a lot of spotlight and momentum, and also a lot of senior people who maybe have never previously worked flexibly, whatever that means, and knowing that there's so many variants of that. But it feels like, do you know what, if we haven't addressed this before, we've got this golden little window of opportunity right now. So although the topic is a bit, okay, here we go again, another discussion about flexible working, and for those of us who are interested in this topic, it does feel to me like what's different is, 2022, 2023, these are the years in which we really need to go somewhere with this. And, it's great to see the policies you've just been talking about, because, come through.
Yeah, to consolidate.
Sorry.
What we've learned.
I was going to come back in. Sorry, Ursula.
Yeah.
I'm an interrupter by my nature. I'm so sorry.
Go for it.
And I was just going to come back to you both and say, it is absolutely an economic imperative, but also, we're right in the midst of an employment crisis. We haven't got enough people to fill the jobs to deliver the services that we need. And I think we are really blinkered if we don't look at flexibility as a way that we're going to unlock some of those jobs. It almost feels like we're going around saying we can't see what the solution is. And we're all saying, this is the solution. This is what people are looking for. People now are walking away from jobs that are inflexible. People have done, you know, in the worst of circumstances, have absolutely delivered the best, and we really need to recognise that. And I think it is absolutely an economic imperative. And one thing we really do need to see much more of is flexible leaders. We need to see flexible CEOs, we need to see flexible execs, and we need them to be visible and flexible and unashamedly living that flexibility.
I always talk about it as a virtual permission slip. Like, you know, if you see somebody working flexibly who you know, are either reporting into, or somebody who's very, very visible, that gives you a virtual permission slip to do the same, or to explore doing the same thing. I think it's so the power of role modeling. I mean, we could talk about a webinar just on that, couldn't we?
Can I just, sorry to just come a bit, just on Kushya's point about the whole economy. There's been this report that everybody's seen about how one of the biggest problems that the UK labour market force is facing is that there's a huge amount of inactivity, especially of older workers, especially of long-term illness. And this is, again, absolutely, the answer is right there in front of us in terms of what we need to do. It's about providing phased retirement, kind of reduced hours, but without any penalties or penalization of their opportunities, working from home, flexible schedules, all of that. Easily solvable. It's a matter of, but you know, it's a matter of will and possibly unwillingness to look at the data and the evidence behind that as well.
And I think I totally am with you, Hee-jung. And it's also about leaders understanding in certain organizations, because we're very lucky in that we work with many really progressive organizations who are very willing to embrace and experiment with different ways of working, which involves a certain degree of vulnerability, doesn't it? But in those organizations who have moved out of the pandemic in embracing what they perceive to be flexible working by prescribing a certain number of days in the office where their workforce are able to work in a hybrid way, in office-based and desk-based roles, and then that box is ticked, you know. So what we've seen in those organizations is lots and lots of turnover, because those kinds of flexible working arrangements are so inflexible. So that's a really interesting dynamic as well in so many organizations, isn't it?
Well, and it's why we can't just lump flexible, like that's too big a word. I mean, you presented that, I thought, really nicely in the research. It stands out, and the different naming that you've got for different types of flexibility. I think we still struggle around that.
Definitely.
You know, occasionally working in your home office for a couple of hours on a Friday afternoon is a pretty massively, radically different form of flexible working than working perhaps 2 days a week in various different locations depending on the week. Or, you know, there's just such. So I think one of the things we've got to do is critique flexible when we hear that word. You know, we need to look at, well, what does it mean? We need to emerge the stories, the diversity of flexibility. You know, we talk about diversity a lot in parallel with the flexibility conversation. It's all diverse flexibility. Feels like we need to investigate that with more curiosity.
If I think as well, I think, sorry, Hee-jung, I was just going to say, I think linked to that is part of the reason we've had this prescribed flexibility, which, by the way, I hate on the very fibre of my existence. Either be flexible or don't lie to me about it. But what that has exposed, and I think why so many people have had such a difficult journey, and we get this 3-day model or 2-day model, is because it exposes other workplace policies that don't exist. And we really need to have an overhaul of people-led policies in workplaces, of which flexible working should be one, that demonstrates that this is an effective place. And we look at a whole suite of issues. So, you know, things like communication, your quality impact assessments, how you look at pay progression, how you look at CPD, what is your transparency around basically everything from a person's entry to exit in your career, that journey. And I think because flexible working has come like this huge meteor in the middle of it, people are trying to address just that without addressing all the things that go around it. And this is why we're getting this. You can work, you know, half an afternoon, but we're not going to look at the workload you have to deliver in that time or the structures that are around it. yeah, it's a big challenge, but Hee Jung's, I'm going to forever quote her now, it's about whether the will is there to do it and to realise all of those things affect how this works, and we have to look at them in the round.
So what I wanted to say was that, so one of the things, if you really want to use flexible working, the great thing about flexible working is that it can meet so many different demands for workers, for companies, etc. It's a completely win-win. But one of the fundamental things, if you're going to be able to use flexible working as a manager, as a company, is that you need to trust that the workers know when and where to work and deliver the key performance indicators or your key targets or whatever outputs there is. There was a question about performance or productivity. And another fundamental question that we still need to ask, and in a way business leaders as well as managers need to do, is that we need to completely redefine productivity if you're going to be able to use flexible working well. And this is something that Caitlin actually mentioned in her talk as well, that if you don't have a very clear indicator of exactly what this company is about, what is that the team needs to deliver, then you're not able to do that. And also, again, this is about the trust issue. So if you trust workers, you'll be able to get incredibly good outputs from them, regardless of where they work and when they work. So, but for managers, it is about power, and it's about the experiences of many, especially many C-suite executives, having gone through an organization or company of a certain type where they do not want to lose that power and or ways of working, which they have benefited, but they and many others that look like them benefited from. So it isn't just about being a bit silly and not looking at the data. This is an intentional kind of way of not looking at the data, because it is again, it's about power and the positions of privilege that they want to maintain. And again, this is why it is also an equality diversity issue as well.
Absolutely. Hey, John. Simon, were you just about to?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on Hee Jung, you mentioned trust there and relationships and also kind of monitoring. And sort of given the sort of the issues of kind of part-time work that that sort of Caitlin sort of presented to us earlier on, I think it's really important that we think about how leaders and managers can and employers, what they can do to support part-time workers. And just thinking about that, you know, a huge part of it is understanding why is it that people want to work part-time. And for many people, in many cases, it might be a positive lifestyle choice, but in many others, these individuals don't have as much agency as they'd like. And for context, we know that childcare costs in the UK are amongst the most expensive in the developed world, and only seem to be increasing. And this survey also showed us that I think 72% of mothers who were working part-time, they cited childcare costs. So it's given that it's really important that kind of managers, you know, they don't assume that because someone is working part-time, it's because they're less committed to their role or they're not interested in career development. It's often a financial decision. And yeah, given that, it's really important to have sort of career-based conversations about how a manager can support their part-time workers and think about their aspirations. And crucially, at a more strategic level, it's about looking at your organization and looking at kind of progress and performance within it, and seeing how your part-time workers are doing. Are they performing well? But over the years, are they not progressing? Are they not getting promotions? And they're looking to address that with either training for managers so they can manage their flexible working teams in a better way, or alternatively putting in progression pathways and training development opportunities for part-time workers themselves.
Such important advice for employers there, Simon, thank you. And actually quite a lot of what you've talked about in that last part of the conversation were so many of the topics that I wanted to talk to you about. So thank you all for the organic evolution of that conversation there. Simon, I would love to continue the conversation about employers supporting part-time workers, because we need to, the data shows us that there is a clear need to support and encourage men to increase their involvement in childcare. So what do you believe are the changes that we need to see to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of two sides of the same coin, isn't it? It's supporting part-time workers who we know are predominantly women, but it's also about encouraging men and making them feel that they work in a culture that sort of allows them and will support them to be more sort of active fathers and caregivers. So there's different ways that I think that can be done. Part of it is through having the policies in place. Kind of more generous paternity leave, for example, or enhanced pay for shared parental leave to encourage people to actually take up these policies. That can go a long way. But I think more importantly, or well, as equally as important, it's the communication around all this as well. For example, within a workplace, are men able to feel that they can go out and pick their child up from school or look after their child when they're sick? Are managers are they asking men about their families, or do they just ask women about their families? Kind of little things like that can make a big difference in the culture. Someone also mentioned role modeling earlier on. So what senior leaders are doing, is it knowing that they've taken some time off to go to their kids' nativity play, things like that. Generally, sort of how can you give sort of caregiving fathers visibility in the workplace? The other system that can be really good is having networks of support if you're as part of a large employer, where people can sort of talk about the issues they've had or the enjoyment they've had from being able to take leave work early to pick up their kid or things like that.
Yeah, there's so many really simple things that we can do, aren't there, Bex?
I was just as Simon was talking, I was suddenly struck. Gosh, there's 6 videos on this screen right now, and 1/6 of those is represented by a man, and so there's I don't know what the gender split actually people attending this session right now is. My hunch would be that as a topic, it's more likely to tend to draw women in, because it's something, for all of the reasons that have been presented and all the data that's showing, it's a topic, flexible working, that challenges women more strongly. And I think, just as you were speaking, Simon, I was thinking, well, it was just reinforcing to me that, as with so many aspects of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, we need to be getting all genders involved in this debate, so that it's not just, despite what the data might be saying about women, having the pinch point more strongly, that we need to all be talking about this.
Can I just come in here again? Why it's more women? It's because, and I mean, like Caitlin said it, and others have said it. It's because in our society, despite kind of the assumption that we have come a really great deal of way in terms of achieving gender equality, we haven't. And women are expected to be the ones responsible for childcare and housework. And women are doing the bulk of the housework and childcare, in some cases when children are young, up to 5 times as much as men, much time as men. And the women don't have any options but to talk about flexible working, because it's either that or not working. And women, again, can I remind everybody, that have been are in higher numbers in tertiary education and higher education for decades now. The untapped resources of the women across the world, but also in the UK, is immense. And again, it ties to the productivity issue. But to be able to change that conversation, we can't just look at flexible working as a single tool. Mm-hmm. We need to start talking about providing shared parental leave, or essentially pushing men into households with good, generous pay in the very early stages of a child's life. If we don't do that, all of this conversation about flexible working isn't going to get anywhere, because there's going to be fundamental structural kind of normative views about what men's roles are and what women's roles are. And this, again, is not just about childcare. How about elderly care as well? Informal care. We need to be pushing men to do the elderly care for elderly parents or disabled family members, etc. And unless we do that, this flexible working tool is just going to actually, as again, exacerbate some of these inequalities that already exist.
Absolutely right. Thank you. Kezia, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I can't talk about things like this without getting really angry, because it is, and Heejun articulates it so much more calmly than I ever would. And so thank you. But the reality is exactly that, which is this is just one aspect and an outlet, I suppose, of massive inequality that women face. And let's be really, really honest, men are not systemically disadvantaged in the same way that women are. So men don't need our support in the same way that women do to really unlock that. However, what we do need is to unlock the benefits of the workforce so it benefits men and women, so that we can have more equality, so we can have women in better paid jobs, in more jobs, in not lock them into things like 0 hours contracts or in industries that don't serve them, and also not then have a situation where men are forced, and it is forced, or men are designed, or men's jobs are designed, should I say, so that they're not able to be present and be those roles at home, because that is the division. The penalty that women play in the labour market, men play in the roles that they have in the lives of their children and their families. And that does need really incisive and distinct action to address. And I think that we talk a lot about shared parental leave, but actually, I'd like to be radical. I think we need additional parental leave. But I don't think, we should take away from one parent and divide that between two. I think we should give people the opportunity to actually think, Jesus Christ, our life is going to change for the next 18 years. Let's get our head around that, for a little while. And there has to be a political will for that to happen. We have to recognize that this is an important part of who we are, and we have to enable people to be their best at home so that they can be their best at work. I've probably told Caitlin this. I tell this to everyone. I paid the parent penalty so that I could have a career. Then I had a kid, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind that every single aspect of my working life would change, but also how I thought about my working life would change, and what I needed to give my focus to would change. And I think that there is a real need for us to think about the discrimination that people face in maternity, that they face when they have children, that men face in the expectations that are placed on them at that point. And we need really effective leave policies to support them. And that is only one aspect, but I think that is a quick win aspect of that. And flexible working, although in and of itself is a tiny tool, is a big way for us to unlock that as well. But if we improve it for women, we improve it for men. It's not like we have to look at men separately.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kudsia. Bex, I'd like to talk to you about something that we talked about briefly earlier on, about the career progression of part-time workers. So how can employers actively support the career progression of part-time workers who currently experience this penalty that we're talking about in terms of their career progress?
Well, I think, how employers support part-time workers links to the whole thing around creating more inclusive, family-friendly cultures. So the first thing I think we need to do is to recognize that there's a really strategic board level debate going on here. So often when we start talking about policies and the details, and when the word family is used, it can feel like a sort of fringe issue that there might be a discussion that's happening in one part of the business, but is not necessarily the conversation that's being had at the very top. So I think recognizing that there's a strategic link between supporting part-time workers, being more inclusive, being more family friendly, because it's part of creating more inclusive workplaces. It's not just doing something nice for the parents. It's a fundamental part of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's a huge spotlight on that topic more broadly, of course. But I think the topic we're talking about today really fits into the heart of that. So we need to raise up that strategic link so that the debate is being had at the correct level. I think so often I see and I coach so many people who are really at their wits' end. There's some of the kind of scenarios we've talked about today, tearing my hair at some of the kind of questions that we're seeing in chat. How do I deal with it when the line manager is kind of stuck in the dark ages, or My company doesn't even have the tech. It's very paper-based, and we don't have the tech to be able to work flexibly. You know, we need to have those kinds of discussions are about choices with budget allocation to a large degree, choices about strategic focus and direction. So I think that kind of elevating it to a strategic conversation is really important. A second thing is about recognizing the systemic nature here. You know, we again, it's very easy to go to the people, the immediate people. So the immediate parent who's affected, the individual. And of course, I mean, I'm got 3 boys. I'm a working parent myself. I work flexibly. I'm in it. I live it as well as working in it. But you know, we've got to go systemic. We've got to look at what can the system around the individual do to support. And that includes, you know, I'm sure that includes all of the sort of policy procedure side of things, yes, but also looking at certainly what we do within our work at Talking Talent as a coaching organization. You know, we coach line managers, we coach senior leaders around, look, how can you make your whole workplace more open, more inclusive? What are some of the things you might need to watch out for if you've got team members who are looking to work part-time? If you're in that scenario of somebody's coming to you and wants to reduce their hours having come back perhaps from having a baby. So strategic, systemic, and then the third thing I'd say is really around support. And gosh, we could talk for like 3 hours on that, but I think it's the headlines to me are around beyond the I suppose my interest and what we do at Talking Talent is through coaching is really try to provide a deeper, more tailored kind of support to people, so that you can help people navigate this. Because I mean, I've been scanning the questions coming up, and I'd love to be able to provide a kind of quick fix, snappy answer. But the reality is, I think, you know, it's really hard. It's hard to balance the sometimes conflicting needs of a demanding business that's got shareholders crying out for value. And yeah, of course, at one level, the more time you can give, the easier it is to overperform. But I think we do need to look at how do we measure greatness in performance beyond hours clocked in. You know, it's definitely time for us to be doing that. We need to be recognizing. So I think line managers to keep that eye on, well, what are the other ways of recognizing, yeah, that person's gone above and beyond. Organizations that have got performance rating scales, you know, how do you measure that? How do you measure them the more beyond just, oh, they've put loads more hours in?
And also, you know, the addressing of the bias towards part-time workers, which exists among leaders and managers, right? Because that is,
yeah, I mean, even the word part, I mean, it's loaded with
stigma.
You're such a part-timer.
Yeah, it's derogatory. It's used as a derogatory term, right?
Well, it is. And we need to, I mean, in my book, everyone works part-time. Every single person who works part-time. You know, nobody works 24/7. So the whole part-time thing only comes about because of back in the Industrial Revolution, somebody decided that 9 to 5, Monday to Friday was the thing. Yeah. I mean, we can recreate that, surely, but it takes leadership. So I think that's a final quick point. I mean, again, could go on it, but is leadership. We need to be supporting, not just wishing for, but actively investing in and supporting leaders of the future. Again, the diversity piece is incredibly important, because the more diverse in so many ways we can make our top leadership teams, the more there are going to be different voices at the table bringing some of these things and insisting on their performance for the bottom line.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Bex. I'd like to
sorry, Ursula, can I just come into just one thing that's really on the tip of my tongue, and it jumps off what Bex was saying, which is, I think, you know, that is a beautiful summary, and that leadership is a reflection of the fact that the leaders we have at all levels don't reflect people that have needed to work flexibly or have needed to benefit flexibly, have in their lives benefited from flexible arrangements. You know, might be part-time working that their partners had, or traditional models of schooling, so have been able to commit themselves to their jobs in a you know, in an hours spent their way. And I think the need for more representation at all levels of diverse people is really important to enable diverse ways of working to become the mainstream. And we've got to see that change at a leadership level, or we've got to see policy change driven by leaders that reflects that diversity.
That's good, yeah.
Can I just say something on, but more the societal level? I think also underpinning the stigmatization of part-time work is that organizations don't recognize that part-time workers often are actually working when they're not working for the company, and there's a general undervalorization of unpaid work. And I think we also need a shift towards a political economic model that recognizes that we are all care dependent at one stage or the other in our life. And it is very important for our society to be able to provide high quality care, and even if it doesn't fit within the business model, this is something that underpins any business model, is the functioning of our society and our economy.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'm just very conscious we've got a lot of questions in the chat, and we have actually tackled quite a lot of what's in there, which is wonderful. It's just happened organically as part of the conversation. There's quite a few questions around job design. And one thing that I particularly wanted to draw out was this question from an anonymous attendee around the lack of genuinely part-time professional roles. Do you think this reflects a lack of imagination and an adherence to the long hours culture? And if that is the case, how can we change this? Simon, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. I noticed the questions on job design, and I think this is really linked to the sort of systemic kind of challenges that we've spoken about. And these require proactive measures rather than just letting people request flexible working. We should be thinking about sort of the job design and how through that we can destigmatize flexible working. So I think just a quick stat to give you: we know that 38% of women work part-time, but if we look at senior roles, according to the Working Families benchmark that we ran last year, we saw that only 7% of senior roles were done on a part-time basis. So you don't need to be a mathematician to see the problem there with pay progression and things like that. So yeah, with that in mind, I think it's really important that employers are thinking creatively about roles that they're offering. Can they be, can it be a job share? Because then that provides a really good sort of progression route for people. And also, could we think more creatively as well, sort of on a bigger scale, kind of potentially could there be tax incentives to sort of provide those kind of roles as well? Because I think there'd be additional benefits with that too.
Great. Thank you, Simon. The next thing that I just wanted to draw out of the audience questions is around advertising of roles. So Barbara says flexible working should ideally be part of the conversation, as we know, when jobs are offered, not after a role is taken up. And as Kudzia outlined, what is problematic about the proposed legislative change is that it's still on the onus for the prospective employee to broach the subject of flexible working if it's not advertised. And we know that only around a quarter, only around 1 in 4 roles are currently advertised as part-time, which far outstrips the demand for part-time roles in the UK. So what solutions are there, our wonderful panel? How can we support employers to address the challenges with designing roles which are truly flexible, and to then communicate that within their job descriptions?
I was just going to say, this is a really good question. And the answer is there isn't a golden bullet for this. And I think we have to recognize that there is flexibility for all jobs, right? We saw that in the pandemic, flexibility got synonymous with home working, and then it became a real divisive line between jobs that could be done at home and jobs that couldn't. And I think we have to reclaim the flexibility of it, and all jobs have some degree of flexibility, and that is for employers, I think, to really sit down and talk to the people that do those jobs. So you have I would say, your trade unions in your role, in your workplaces, and where you haven't got trade unions, you might have staff affinity groups, but that job design can work there. And also let's be really, really, really honest. It is not beyond the will of man to design jobs that are flexible. We're talking like it's NASA scientist level. It isn't. It's about looking at these roles. Well, how can they be flexible? And all those things we talked about, what outputs do we want to measure if we want to measure outputs? What do we want the job to look like? And are we prepared to be trusting in our staff and allow them to deliver on it? And I think it's going to be really twee, but communication and dialogue are real key to designing those jobs. And from my perspective, I think trade unions have got a really big role as acting as a broker between workplaces and the people that do those jobs as well. And obviously organizations like yours exist, like Rebecca's exist, like Simon's exist, who have expertise in the work that Hejung does, that employers can go to make themselves feel better about the decisions they're going to make.
Yeah, I think we can bring together quite a lot of the strands of like big topics of the day: the great attrition, flexibility, trying to attract talent, and so on. You don't ever get the best candidate for the role. You get the best applicant for the role. So again, it's to my point about we need to make this a more strategic conversation. If we're serious about this, then we need to, there was another question, I think, in the previously submitted things about how can philanthropists support this beyond just funding some research? Well, this is my blue sky thought here is, I feel like there's some kind of big campaign needed. I'd see a kind of hashtag Flexit or something of, we've got to kind of push companies to hit them with the data on what it's costing them to not advertise jobs flexibly, and give them just one or two easy things to do to make it more flexible. Because actually, my hunch is that a lot of those jobs that are advertised without flexibility, if you were to pluck up the courage to ask, you might find that there's an avenue to explore. So let's move around that. Yeah, Hejung.
Oh no, I just wanted to say, like, what a key thing, and again, Kusha said this, but it's so if you look at the Netherlands, where a lot of those things have gone very well and nice, even part-time work isn't stigmatized as much. And again, one of the reasons I want to kind of highlight, and I think Caitlin said this a bit, the reason why part-time work is stigmatized is because it is perceived as a mother's arrangement, and mother's work capacity is always stigmatized because the assumption is that when you become a mom, you're not going to be a good worker or productive. Again, there's another campaign we need to try to tackle, but I think really important is the workers' capacity bargaining power is really important here. And that's an example we see across Europe. Those places where flexible working worked well, flexible working was considered a default, is because workers had the negotiation power collectively. And it might be because the companies were really struggling to find talent to fill in those job roles. And I think this is something that can be done a bit more collectively to make sure that workers are in the position to say, oh, let's look at the job. This is how I could do it best. Can we then make it like that? And, we could also help to make that kind of, enable workers to be in that position. Again, the TUC is one, but I think a lot of the organizations that we're talking about can be that. And it includes even maybe providing with the empirical research that myself and others have done to show that, again, a lot of the backwards thinking, the old kind of style thinking of managers are actually not evidence-based. It's not scientific, and it's actually going to be hindering their own companies.
Thank you, Hejung, and thank you all, because I feel like what we've done within this hour is we've just systematically opened a load of cans of worms for everyone to go away and think about. So
flung the worms all over the place.
Yeah, they're everywhere. The worms are everywhere. The toothpaste is out of the tube, and we can't possibly tackle in the depth that we would all ideally love to, I'm sure it's fair to say, tackle those issues and explore all the potential solutions within this hour. So from my perspective, if anybody who's been watching this is curious or wants to talk about this more, if we didn't get to your question, because sadly we've run out of time, I know we've covered a lot of ground and we've tried to weave in some of the questions that you've asked us as parts of the conversation have progressed. But if there is more that you'd like to talk to any of us about, please reach out after the webinar, because we're all, look, there's furious nodding among everybody. Yeah, please reach out, because we are obviously all committed to these solutions, and to we're all in this together, I feel, in this very special space that we work in. So please reach out, and thank you to everybody, to our incredible panel today, for your insights, for your time, for your expertise, and for the conversation today, which I feel has been hugely valuable. Thank you to you for watching, and for me, you know, thanks for a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a lovely day.
You too. Bye-bye.